prepared remarks, just to give you context for why AT&T cares. Most people are familiar with the U.S. presence of AT&T and the diversified things that we do here. But in addition to that, the work that keeps me busy is that we are active all over the world. And in our bilateral relationships that we've had for decades, and with the roaming relationships that allow you to be able to communicate and connect in all but about 4 jurisdictions around the world, there's a lot of work involved in that, and rule of law comes into that. We also have presence where we operate with our own license and our own entity in around 70 countries, and have significant operations in Mexico with mobile business, and throughout Latin America, where the DirecTV Latin American pay TV business is. So it's a very mixed business, very internationally oriented, and so these issues of rule of law, I think about it a lot, because it's fundamental to our very ability to operate and our investment decisions. And that's a bit of what I want to talk about today. You know, and just as a framing thought, some people think of rule of law in a very academic sense sometimes, but it's very, very pragmatic. It's a core part of business strategy. It is something that business leaders and strategists have to think about very carefully at the early stages of market entry, market competition, and to be vigilant about throughout. It's a value that we have to preserve in developed markets, and it's something that we have to work very hard to strengthen in emerging markets. Weak rule of law attracts weak strategy, attracts weak market performance. I particularly think the UN definition is a good one. It's one that I base a lot of my thought and work about. And the UN says, it's a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. It requires, as well, measures to ensure adherence to the principles of supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. Where the rule of law is weak, medicines fail to reach health facilities, criminal violence goes unchecked, laws are applied unequally, and foreign investments are held back. And conversely, effective rule of law reduces corruption. It drives truly competitive markets, improves public health, enhances education, alleviates poverty, and protects people from injustices and dangers large and small. As I've said already, and as I experience all the time, rule of law does correlate to foreign direct investment. And this is an important message, particularly to emerging markets that are constantly thinking about how to make their economies attractive to stable and predictable investment. Experienced companies carefully study the quality of rule of law in markets. And as a strategic planning matter, this does correlate with investment decisions. I see that firsthand all the time.
And I'm glad Eric did the heavy lift, and he's a little humble. He says when the private sector shows up, some people even say we can be helpful. I don't know what else there is other than the private sector in terms of being helpful, right? We're way too modest, and so thank you for all you do. So there's vertically and then horizontally at the federal level, he separated judicial, legislative, executive. Separation of power. How are we doing on that one? We centralize all power in the president and the executive because we need to win our next election and we don't want a hard vote. Right? So all power is up here in DC in one person, and that's starting to sound like 2,000 years of history. Right? And all regimes over 2,000 years of history, how did they do? They all collapsed because of an overemphasis on the federal level, right? Kings and despots and tyrants and whatever. Right? So the rule of law matters fundamentally.
You know, I think that when you see the breakdown of rule of law, when you see illicit finance, you have no further look than what's happening right now in Venezuela. And what that does to that country, what that does to the people that are living there, what that does to destabilize the region. I'm headed out to South America this Friday, and we'll be seeing that and talking to people that are all around Venezuela and how that is. And I think that personally, in my opinion, the United States has to pay a little more attention to our backyard in the Western Hemisphere. But again,
what I've been working on over the last 2 to 3 years, and this is what has been already mentioned, the case of Hable, which is a bank headquartered in Austria. It's never been a bank. Why not? Because a bank usually, if it gives out loans, usually tries to have the loans paid back at some point in time. But this organization, let's call it that way, has never been interested in actually getting the loans back. It was basically the bank handing out loans without collateral, and if necessary, the valuations made by experts were faked, and most of the money has not been returned to the bank. And it disappeared in various channels. And the beneficiaries of all these loans were disguised, basically, were hidden by shell companies in Liechtenstein. Officially, the money was taken out by a project company. Project company said, we will build something very nice and beautiful, and in Austria or in Eastern Europe, a hotel, apartment blocks. Got the money without collateral, and these project companies belong to shell companies in Liechtenstein, managed by trustees. And as you know, with these kind of companies, well, they don't really belong to someone, at least legally. So the interesting question is, well, who are the beneficiaries? Who are the ones who actually benefit still from this enterprise, even if there's no legal owner? And that this was made, that these transactions, or many of these transactions was made via Liechtenstein is no coincidence. The only cause or the only interest that why this was made this way is to take advantage of anonymity. That these beneficiaries of these payments, of these loans, could remain anonymous. And that's what Liechtenstein and a few other countries offer, its anonymity. Institutions, companies, structures that allow you to remain anonymous. Because what we've discovered during our investigation in the Austrian Parliament is, well, as I said, it's not only a loss to the taxpayers in the amount of roughly 15 billion euros. It's also that, well, call it the bank robbers, all these people who set up all these smart ideas and constructions to basically steal the money, that most of them are still at large. And that from the point of view of a working legal system, not much or nothing has been done. Well, actually, whether the courts are independent, whether the judges are independent is entirely irrelevant if the state, the public prosecution is politicized. So if you can exercise control over the public prosecutors, it's totally irrelevant whether the courts are independent or not. And in the case of Hable, which is the biggest criminal case Austria or even Europe has ever been confronted with, if you look at this as a parliamentarian, but also from the perspective of a citizen, you can only be outraged that this happened. And not only that it happened, but the fact that there were hardly any legal consequences. And you can call them bank robbers, because that's what they are, that they're still at large. And you must imagine how this feels to the ordinary citizens who observe this and realize that when they do something wrong in their ordinary life, the state is very quick with sanctions. But then if the trouble is millions and billions of euros, then nothing seems to happen. And the billions are gone. Nobody cares where they're gone. I mean, they're still there. It's just that the ownership has changed. And the gangsters are at large. And the problem of corruption, the problem of political corruption, the problem of organized crime and money laundering is much larger than we think. And much larger also in Austria. And you might think that this is not the case because the surface looks so good. But if you just scratch a little bit, it doesn't look good beneath the surface. What we see in general is that political corruption, that organized crime, that money laundering systematically crosses national boundaries and borders. And that governments are either not capable of keeping up and sometimes are not willing to keep up. And if this happens, if this continues to happen, the rule of law will continue to be in retreat. The rule of law will be further damaged, justice loses, and the trust in the legal system will erode. And let me remind you, the fact that laws work is not because they are passed in the parliament. It's not the way it works. These laws and accepting that if you don't abide, you get sanctioned. That's a culture. And if this culture erodes, if people don't feel any point in abiding the rules and the laws, because there's always a group not doing it and getting away with it, then the whole system that we've created in the past centuries erodes and, well, is really in danger. That the problem is much larger than we think, that it's international, and that we need to work together on an international basis to confront this issue.
It sounds great. The rule of law is one of those topics nobody's going to argue against it, but yet how do we find ourselves here where we are? And the problems facing the international community, the private sector as they go to invest in different nations. And there's just a slight little deviation that takes place. Because 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan talked about tearing down the wall, focusing on the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, and what people thought was coming behind that was sound economic policy, and with it the rule of law. But the rule of law, whether it be in Eastern Europe or Russia and other places, in other countries, the rule of law can be hijacked by what now people are starting to recognize is the rule of law can be taken and it can become the rule by law. And whether it be administrative officials or judges, rule by law can be used to mask and hide and justify all sorts of acts which are then given the color or the presumption of reliability when, and permissiveness, when they shouldn't get that. And now we struggle with how do we get behind that? And how does the international legal community deal with that? They're wrongfully accused. Because it is amazing the number of people out there and the number of governments that are trying to hijack the legal system. And in an effort to silence political opponents or to silence competitors, to steal competitors' businesses. In some jurisdictions, it's easier to go out and bribe a local prosecutor, bribe a judge, and win a verdict, or have your competitor thrown in jail and prosecuted. And then you can buy the competitor out at a fraction of what the business is worth, because there may be infamous offer. You can spend the next 20 years in jail, and you can sell me your company for X number of dollars.